The topic of vaccine passports has become fraught over the past couple of weeks, and I want to take a few moments here to share some reflections on this subject. Now, initially, it does seem like an affront to our individual personal liberty to be forced to tote around an indication that we're part of a vaccinated group just to avail ourselves of basic activities and privileges that seem quite central and integral to our human happiness and our well-being. And at the same time, passports and even vaccine passports aren't even remotely novel concepts. Obviously, if you've traveled internationally, you comprehend the utility of having a document that proves your identity and nationality. And if you've ever been to India or parts of Africa, you've likely received that little yellow card that is an indication of inoculation against diphtheria and malaria and yellow fever. And without that little yellow card, you will not be admitted into many of these countries, and probably for good bloody reason. I suppose, though, the difference between this analog yellow piece of paper and the new renditions of passports that are being considered is that these new iterations will be digitized, and that does raise some legitimate issues. I mean, first of all, we do not want digital passports to exacerbate the chasm between global haves and global have-nots. We've all witnessed income inequality effloresce during the pandemic to epic proportions and become one of our most prescient global problems. And clearly, there will be people that want to avail themselves of the vaccine and cannot for some reason, and there will be other people, maybe some of the same people, that cannot own or cannot afford a smartphone that will display the QR code that indicates one's vaccinated status. I mean, in short, what we need to avoid is the establishment of two separate, distinct classes of global citizens, one that can move about and one that cannot. The other issue that comes up with great frequency around this topic is data. Who's going to own it? If anyone, will it be encrypted? Probably. I think on this topic, it's important to acknowledge in the Western world that digital data is generally not leveraged for surveillance a la authoritarian China. It is leveraged, however, for capitalism. Advertisers and marketers mine your pensions and proclivities all day long through cookieing you, and then turn around and market you products and services and trinkets based around the interest that they already know that you have. So if you're on your phone with any frequency in the Western world, I believe that that bird has flown. It is important, though, to acknowledge that we're not just talking about vaccine passports for international travel. We're also considering it for domestic activities. For example, Live Nation and AEG are considering instituting vaccine passports for large-scale concerts. Now, they are the biggest promoters of music in the world, and it is worth noting that over the last year, their industry has been decimated, and it's important for them to get back to market, not just for them, but for all the thousands of musicians that have been out of work. And God knows I'd love to go to a show just to be in the audience. But it's important to also acknowledge that they are not considering these passports for any surveillance purposes. They're not trying to monitor my freaking bowel movements. They are considering it because they are concerned with legal liability. We live in an incredibly litigious culture, and currently insurance policies do not necessarily protect them against liability. So if people were to come to a large-scale concert and get ill, they might not have protection. So it's important to acknowledge why they are considering the use of passports. This, though, also brings up a larger philosophical issue for me, because I have a friend that just returned from New Zealand, and he's been raging his face off at large-scale concerts with tens of thousands of people for 8 months without any passport and without any vaccine. And upon further examination, there are other countries like Taiwan, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Australia that were able to staunch and stem COVID without any vaccine and without any passports. And the reason why is that they had strong leadership that was able to marshal social cohesion, that there was a sense in these countries that people were willing to make sacrifices of civil liberties and individual freedoms for the sake of the collective good. And ironically, that sacrifice produced more individual freedoms. Now, we're experiencing the flip opposite of that in countries like the United States and Brazil and the United Kingdom, because we were not able to cohere as a society around the collective good, because we sanctify individual freedoms and civil liberties so much. Now we're actually suffering from the absence of it. It's like we trampled ourselves. And I think one of the great lessons here, which also appears in many spiritual traditions, is that self-interest and the collective good are one and the same thing. And if there is any lesson that we can learn here in America, it's that in order to preserve our individual freedoms, in order to have our civil liberties, we need to cohere socially around the biggest societal challenges. This will be the key to freedom.